In the heart of a serene suburban neighborhood, nestled among tall trees and well-manicured lawns, stood a quaint two-story house. Within its walls resided Sarah, a young woman of grace and poise, whose days were usually filled with the warmth of her husband's presence. Yet as twilight descended, casting long shadows across the familiar rooms, Sarah found herself alone, her husband miles away on a business trip. The evening began like any other. Sarah prepared a simple dinner for herself, the rhythmic clinking of utensils against plates echoing in the empty kitchen. As darkness settled outside, she drew the curtains tight, seeking solace in the soft glow of lamplight. With her husband's absence weighing heavily on her mind, Sarah sought refuge in mundane tasks, tidying up the living room and flipping through channels on the television. But as the night grew deeper, a sense of unease began to creep into her consciousness. Each creak of the floorboard seemed amplified in the silence, every shadow morphing into a potential threat in her imagination. She chastised herself for being paranoid, for allowing her thoughts to wander down dark alleys of fear. Yet try as she might, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Midnight approached with stealthy footsteps, the world outside enveloped in a shroud of stillness. Sarah retired to her bedroom, seeking sanctuary beneath the covers of her bed, but sleep eluded her, slipping through her fingers like grains of sand. It was then that she heard it, a faint rustling, barely audible over the hum of the night. Sarah's heart quickened its pace, her senses sharpening as she strained to locate the source of the sound. She held her breath, ears pricked for any sign of movement. And then, like a whisper on the wind, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, and undeniably human. Panic surged through Sarah's veins, rendering her limbs heavy and unresponsive. She wanted to scream, to call out for help, but fear had stolen her voice. The footsteps drew closer, the intruder's presence a tangible weight in the air. Sarah's mind raced, grappling with the grim reality of her situation. What did they want? Money, possessions, or something far more sinister? As if in answer to her unspoken question, the bedroom door creaked open, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening in terror as she beheld the shadowy figure lurking in the doorway. It was a man, a stranger, his features obscured by the cloak of night. He moved with predatory grace, advancing into the room with silent intent. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, a primal instinct urging her to flee, to escape the clutches of this unknown assailant. But fear held her rooted to the spot, her muscles betraying her desperate pleas for flight. She watched helplessly as the intruder drew nearer, his gaze fixated upon her like a predator stalking its prey. And then, with a suddenness that stole the breath from her lungs, he spoke, a voice like ice, devoid of mercy or remorse. "I don't want your money," he murmured, his words sending a cold sweat down Sarah's neck. "I want you." Terror seized Sarah's heart in a vice-like grip, her mind reeling at the implications of his words. She was trapped, alone and defenseless, with nothing but her wits to ward off the impending danger. Frantically, she scanned the room for a means of escape, her gaze alighting on the window overlooking the backyard. It was her only chance, her last hope of evading the clutches of her would-be assailant. Summoning every ounce of courage she possessed, Sarah launched herself from the bed, her bare feet pounding against the hardwood floor. The intruder reacted with lightning speed, lunging towards her with outstretched arms. But Sarah was faster, fueled by sheer desperation and the primal instinct to survive. She reached the window in a blur of motion, flinging it open with trembling hands. The cool night air rushed to meet her, a tantalizing promise of freedom beyond the confines of her prison. With a final glance over her shoulder, Sarah leaped into the darkness, the ground rising up to meet her with a jarring impact. Pain exploded through her body, igniting every nerve ending with searing intensity. But amidst the agony, she felt something else, a surge of triumph, of defiance against the forces that sought to consume her. She had escaped, broken free from the clutches of the intruder who had sought to claim her as his own. As she lay crumpled on the ground, her breath ragged and her body battered, Sarah knew that the nightmare was far from over. But she refused to surrender to the darkness, to allow fear to dictate her fate. For she was a survivor, a woman forged in the crucible of adversity, whose strength would carry her through even the darkest of nights. And as the first rays of dawn broke across the horizon, illuminating the world with their golden light, Sarah knew that she would emerge from this ordeal stronger than ever before. But little did she know, the intruder was not finished with her. As the days passed and Sarah tried to regain a sense of normalcy, a shadow loomed over her every move. It was as if the darkness had seeped into her soul, leaving her perpetually on edge, haunted by the memory of that fateful night. She installed security cameras, triple-checked every lock, but still she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It gnawed at her sanity, eroding her sense of safety until she could hardly distinguish between reality and paranoia. Then, one evening, as Sarah sat alone in her living room, the phone rang, a shrill, piercing sound that shattered the fragile calm she had fought so hard to maintain. With trembling hands, she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hello?" There was a moment of silence on the other end, broken only by the sound of heavy breathing. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, her pulse quickening with a sense of dread. And then a voice, a chilling echo from the past, filled the void, sending icy tendrils of fear snaking down Sarah's spine. "It's not over, Sarah," the voice hissed, each word dripping with malice. "I'll always be watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike." Terror seized Sarah's heart once more, her breath catching in her throat as the realization dawned upon her. The intruder was still out there, lurking in the shadows, biding his time until he could exact his revenge. With trembling fingers, Sarah hung up the phone, her mind racing with a million unanswered questions. Who was he? Why had he targeted her? And most importantly, how could she ever hope to escape his grasp? But deep down, she knew the truth. The nightmare was far from over, and Sarah's ordeal had only just begun. For in the darkness that lurked beyond the safety of her home, an unseen evil watched and waited, its hunger for her flesh insatiable. And as the final tendrils of daylight faded into the inky blackness of night, Sarah knew that she would never truly be free, not as long as the shadow of the intruder loomed over her. Story 2. In the quaint suburbs of Maplewood, where the houses stood in neat rows like soldiers awaiting orders, lived a man named Michael. A bachelor in his late 20s, Michael relished the solitude of his modest home, finding solace in the quiet hum of suburban life. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the familiar streets, Michael found himself alone, his neighbors away on vacation, and his own plans canceled at the last minute. Settling into his favorite armchair, Michael sought refuge in the pages of a gripping novel, the soft glow of lamplight casting a warm embrace around him. But as the night wore on and the story unfolded, a restlessness crept into his bones, an itch he couldn't quite scratch. It was then that he heard it, a soft knock at the door, barely audible over the distant hum of passing cars. Michael glanced at the clock, eyebrows furrowing in confusion. Who could possibly be calling at this hour? With cautious steps, he made his way to the front door, heart pounding in his chest as he peered through the peephole. On the other side stood a man, a stranger, his features obscured by the faint light of the porch. "Can I help you?" Michael called out, his voice tinged with apprehension. The man turned towards him, a wide smile spreading across his face. "Good evening, sir," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I'm here on behalf of Sunset Windows and Doors, offering free estimates for homeowners in the area." Michael hesitated, his instincts urging him to send the man away. But something about his demeanor, his polished appearance and disarming smile gave him pause. Reluctantly, he opened the door a crack, allowing the salesman to step onto the porch. The man extended a hand, his grip firm and assured. "My name's Greg," he said, his smile never wavering. "Mind if I come in and tell you about our latest offers?" Michael hesitated, a flicker of unease dancing in the depths of his mind. But curiosity got the better of him, and he stepped aside, allowing Greg to enter his home. As the door closed behind them, Michael led Greg into the living room, gesturing for him to take a seat on the couch. Greg settled in with practiced ease, his gaze sweeping over the room with keen interest. "So, what brings you to Maplewood?" Michael asked, trying to fill the awkward silence that hung between them. Greg shrugged, his smile never faltering. "Just passing through. he replied, his tone casual. "Thought I'd take the opportunity to spread the word about our company." As Greg launched into his sales pitch, Michael found himself growing increasingly uncomfortable, his mind buzzing with unanswered questions. There was something off about Greg, something in the way he moved, the way he spoke, that set Michael's teeth on edge. But try as he might, he couldn't put his finger on it. And so he sat in silence, nodding along as Greg extolled the virtues of sunset windows and doors, his words washing over him like a distant echo. It wasn't until Greg reached into his bag and pulled out a glossy brochure that Michael's unease turned to outright dread. The cover depicted a cheerful family standing in front of a newly installed door, their smiles frozen in place like masks of happiness. Greg handed the brochure to Michael, his smile widening into a grin. "Take a look," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "I think you'll find we have exactly what you're looking for." Michael forced a smile, his fingers trembling as he flipped through the pages. But as he scanned the images of pristine doors and sparkling windows, a chill crept down his neck, a sense of wrongness that he couldn't shake. And then as he reached the final page, he saw it. A photograph of Greg, his face beaming with pride as he posed next to a newly installed door. Except there was something different about him. Something in the coldness of his eyes, the tightness of his smile that sent a shiver down Michael's spine. "Is this you?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Greg's grin faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Of course," he replied, his tone clipped. "Why do you ask?" But Michael wasn't listening. His mind was racing, piecing together fragments of information like a puzzle with no solution. There was something sinister about Greg, something lurking beneath the surface that threatened to consume him whole. With a suddenness that took even himself by surprise, Michael stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. "I think it's time for you to leave," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside him. Greg's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold calculation. "I'm afraid I can't do that," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. "You see, I have a proposition for you, one that I think you'll find very enticing." Before Michael could react, Greg reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small vial filled with a clear liquid. "What's that?" Michael asked, his voice trembling with fear. Greg's smile returned, but it was no longer warm and inviting. It was a predator's smile, full of hunger and malice. "Just a little something to help you relax," he said, his tone dripping with menace. And then, with a flick of his wrist, he uncorked the vial and released its contents into the air. Michael's eyes widened in horror as the noxious fumes filled the room, choking him with their suffocating embrace. He tried to fight back, to push Greg away and escape to safety, but his limbs felt heavy and sluggish, his mind clouded by a fog of confusion and fear. And as the darkness closed in around him, Michael knew. He knew that he would never escape the clutches of the sinister salesman who had come knocking at his door. For in the end, there are some threats that cannot be banished with a mere flick of the wrist. Some dangers lurk in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And as the last vestiges of consciousness slipped away, Michael could only pray that someone, anyone, would come to his rescue before it was too late. But deep down, he knew that his fate had been sealed the moment he opened the door to the deceptive salesman with a sinister intent. Story 3. In a quiet suburban neighborhood where the streets were lined with neatly trimmed lawns and the houses stood like sentinels against the encroaching darkness, resided a teenager named Ethan. With his parents away visiting family for the weekend, Ethan found himself alone in their spacious home, the emptiness echoing around him like a haunting melody. The first night passed without incident, the house enveloped in a peaceful silence that belied the chaos lurking just beyond its walls. But as the hours stretched into the early hours of morning, a sense of unease began to gnaw at Ethan's insides, casting shadows across his restless mind. Alone in the dark living room, bathed in the soft glow of the television, Ethan tried to lose himself in the world of late-night shows and mindless chatter. But every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, sent a cold feeling down his chest, reminding him of his solitary confinement. As the clock struck midnight, Ethan's eyelids grew heavy with fatigue, his body yearning for the solace of sleep. With a reluctant sigh, he dragged himself up from the comfort of the couch and made his way to his bedroom, the darkness of the hallway stretching out before him like an abyss. Closing the door behind him, Ethan slipped beneath the covers of his bed, seeking refuge in the warmth of his blankets. But despite his exhaustion, sleep eluded him, his mind plagued by restless thoughts and unsettling visions. It was then that he heard it, a faint scratching at the window, like the claws of some unseen creature seeking entry into his sanctuary. Ethan's heart quickened its pace, his breath catching in his throat as he strained to listen for any sign of movement. But the scratching ceased as suddenly as it had begun, leaving Ethan to wonder if it had been nothing more than a trick of his imagination. He tried to convince himself that he was safe, that there was nothing to fear in the stillness of the night. Yet even as he closed his eyes and willed himself to sleep, a sense of foreboding lingered in the air, a whisper of danger that refused to be ignored. Hours passed in agonizing silence, each minute stretching out into eternity as Ethan tossed and turned in his bed, unable to escape the grip of his own paranoia. And then, just as the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains, he heard it, a sound that sent a cold chill coursing through his veins. A scream, high-pitched and agonized, echoed through the house, reverberating off the walls like a macabre symphony. Ethan's blood ran cold, his heart seizing in his chest as he struggled to comprehend the horror unfolding around him. With trembling hands, he reached for his phone, his fingers fumbling with the buttons as he dialed 911, praying for salvation in the form of a disembodied voice on the other end of the line. 911, what's your emergency? Came the response, a beacon of hope in the darkness that threatened to consume him. There's someone in my house, Ethan stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Please, you have to help me. As he relayed his address to the operator, Ethan's mind raced with 1,000 unanswered questions. Who was the intruder? What did they want? And most importantly, how had they managed to breach the sanctity of his home? But there was no time for speculation, no room for doubt, as the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, drawing closer with each passing second. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he braced himself for the inevitable confrontation. And then, like a specter emerging from the shadows, the intruder appeared, a figure cloaked in darkness, their features obscured by the veil of night. Ethan's blood ran cold at the sight of them, his mind reeling with the enormity of the threat they posed. But before he could utter a single word, the intruder spoke, a voice tinged with madness, its words a twisted chorus of delusion and despair. They said I was crazy, they muttered, their voice a haunting refrain that made Ethan go cold. But I'll show them. I'll show them all. With a suddenness that stole the breath from his lungs, the intruder lunged forward, their hands outstretched like claws seeking flesh. Ethan recoiled in terror, his instincts screaming at him to flee, to escape the clutches of this deranged assailant. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide as the intruder bore down upon him with relentless fury. And as Ethan stared into the abyss of their eyes, he knew that he was staring into the face of madness itself, a darkness from which there could be no escape. In the end, there was only the scream, the agonized wail of a soul consumed by madness, echoing through the empty halls of a house haunted by the ghosts of its past. And as the final echoes faded into the silence of the dawn, there was only the chilling certainty that some horrors can never be banished, only endured in the cold light of day. Story 4. In a quaint suburban neighborhood where houses stood like silent sentinels guarding their secrets, lived a teenage girl named Emily. With her parents off to their cabin for the weekend, Emily found herself alone in the spacious confines of their home. At first, the prospect of solitude seemed liberating, a chance to revel in the freedom of being untethered from the watchful eyes of her family. But as night descended, casting long shadows across the empty rooms, Emily's sense of independence gave way to an unsettling sense of vulnerability. The first night passed without incident, the house enveloped in a stillness broken only by the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Emily tried to occupy herself with mundane tasks, reading, watching movies, anything to distract herself from the gnawing sense of unease that had settled like a stone in the pit of her stomach. But as the hours stretched into the early hours of morning, Emily found herself unable to shake the feeling that she was being watched. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in around her, suffocating her with their silent scrutiny. With a sigh of frustration, Emily retreated to her bedroom, seeking solace in the cocoon of her blankets. But sleep proved elusive, her mind racing with 1,000 irrational fears and paranoid fantasies. And then, just as she was on the verge of drifting off into a fitful slumber, she heard it. A soft thud, like the sound of a door closing somewhere in the depths of the house. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest as she strained to listen for any further signs of movement. For a long moment, there was nothing but the oppressive silence of the night. But then, like a whisper on the wind, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, echoing through the empty corridors of the house. Panic surged through Emily's veins, her breath catching in her throat as she realized that she was not alone. Her hands shook as she dialed 911, hoping for rescue in the form of a disembodied voice on the other end of the line. 911, what's your emergency? Came the response, a lifeline in the darkness that threatened to consume her. There's someone in my house, Emily whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Please, you have to help me. As she relayed her address to the operator, Emily's mind raced with 1,000 unanswered questions. Who was the intruder? What did they want? And most importantly, how had they managed to breach the sanctity of her home? But there was no time for speculation, no room for doubt as the sound of footsteps grew louder, drawing closer with each passing second. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she braced herself for the inevitable confrontation. And then, like a specter emerging from the shadows, the intruder appeared. A figure cloaked in darkness, their features obscured by the veil of night. Emily's blood ran cold at the sight of them, her mind reeling with the enormity of the threat they posed. But before she could utter a single word, the intruder spoke, a voice tinged with malice, its words a chilling echo in the stillness of the night. "Hello, Emily," they murmured, their voice made the whole room feel cold. "I've been waiting for you." Terror seized Emily's heart in a vice-like grip, her mind racing as she struggled to comprehend the horror unfolding before her. Who was this stranger, and what did they want with her? With trembling hands, Emily reached for the nearest object, a heavy bookend resting on her nightstand, and brandished it like a weapon, her instincts screaming at her to defend herself against this unknown assailant. But the intruder merely laughed, a hollow, mocking sound that freaked Emily out. "You can't stop me, Emily," they taunted, their voice dripping with malice. "I'll always find a way in." And with that ominous proclamation, the intruder vanished into the darkness, leaving Emily alone with her fear and uncertainty. For the rest of the night, Emily huddled beneath her blankets, her senses on high alert for any sign of the intruder's return. But try as she might, sleep remained elusive, her mind consumed by the chilling certainty that this was only the beginning of a nightmare from which she could never truly awaken. And as the first rays of dawn broke across the horizon, illuminating the world with their golden light, Emily knew that she would never be able to erase the memory of the stranger's visit, or the terror that had accompanied it, from her mind. For in the darkness that lurked beyond the safety of her home, an unseen evil watched and waited, its hunger for her flesh insatiable. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, Emily found herself haunted by the memory of that fateful night, tormented by the knowledge that the stranger's presence lingered on,